Today, I want to talk about psychological distress and how police work can actually exacerbate issues with mental health, especially when officers lack support from their agencies and effective stress management skills. So, like any profession that deals with the general public, people are the worst, and working in the criminal justice system can change how you perceive yourself and the world around you. Officers are exposed to the worst of humanity, and as a result, people who work in the justice system can be at a heightened risk for experiencing psychological distress and harm. To better understand this phenomena, my colleagues and I have been exploring exactly this issue. More specifically, how police work impacts officers both during and outside of work. And so in this video, there are three concepts that I want to talk about and how they manifest in not only policing, but human service work in general. There are several different concepts that are often used interchangeably, and while there is some overlap, there are distinct differences between them. The first is vicarious trauma, which involves a negative transformation of an officer's cognitive view of themselves or the world as a result of prolonged indirect exposure to graphic disclosures, horrific events in policing, and narratives of traumatic events. So, doing this work for a while can obviously take a toll on officers, and vicarious trauma is essentially the cumulative effects of regularly listening and empathetically engaging with traumatized citizens. As a result, the cumulative effects of this stress can lead to shifts in how officers process information and develop perceptions about themselves and the world, specifically in 5 areas. The first is safety. Policing can impact an officer's sense of safety and security. If they have children, they may become increasingly overprotective. They may take extra precautions, such as, whenever they go into a restaurant, they never want to sit with their back to the door. They want to be able to see everything that's going on. Others may lose a sense of safety from constantly working with offenders who describe in details how they can break into other people's homes or, specifically hurt people and get away with it. Also, dealing with the criminal element really impacts issues of trust. And so this can impact the capacity to trust others. Officers may develop increased suspicion. They may not hire like a babysitter that is male. They may question their child's coaches or teachers. And officers are lied to all the time, and because of that, they tend to be overly suspicious and critical of the information that they encounter. The third is impacting esteem. This work may make officers feel inadequate, doubting their own abilities to create effective change in their community, and may develop a growing dislike and respect for others and become increasingly cynic and bitter. Additionally, it can also create issues with intimacy. So chronic feelings of emptiness and either a growing dependency on others or conversely, even more isolating behaviors. So this occurs when officers can become either physically or emotionally withdrawn from friends and family members and even other colleagues. They don't like telling people that they are a police officer, and in other situations, for example, like investigating crimes against children or other sexual offenses, viewing child pornography doesn't always help in terms of intimacy outside of work with officers and their sexual partners. And then finally, this work can definitely impact officers' sense of control. They may feel trapped, helpless, or even losing control of their life or their work. Becoming a police officer is a huge investment, and after a while, officers can develop a sense of hopelessness if policing diverges dramatically from what they thought it would be versus the reality. In addition to vicarious trauma, officers and other helping professionals may also start to experience symptoms that closely resemble those of the people they encounter, such as developing anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, and even what we called compassion fatigue. I recently published a study with my colleagues exploring these concepts with professionals who were responsible for investigating crimes against children. So some of the responses tapped into vicarious trauma, while others really emphasized examples of compassion fatigue, and secondary traumatic stress. And the following statements provide good examples of vicarious trauma. When asked what the hardest part about investigating child maltreatment was, a forensic interviewer said how it changed my view of safety in society. A member of an internet crimes against task force said, the hardest thing in the beginning was walking through a store or into a school while off duty and not looking at every child as a potential victim, comparing their faces to the ones I've seen during investigations. Another forensic interviewer said, knowing things about my children's friends and their parents. While another investigator said, I'm more suspicious of people. I dislike public pools and people with cameras who seem to be taking pictures of kids, people they don't know. So as a result of this work, and the hardest part about it is really impacted how investigators perceived a sense of safety, not only for themselves, but of their family members, who they trust, and whether or not they have control over these thoughts and the experiences in which they encounter. The second concept I looked into is called compassion fatigue, which is a term that was popularized in the 1990s to describe the experiences of nurses working with terminally ill patients. And it's described as the cost of caring for others who are in emotional distress. And it's the natural and somewhat consequential behaviors and emotions that result from knowing, reading, or encountering a traumatizing event and not having any control or ability to do anything to make it better. Compassion fatigue involves this intense emotional and physical stress that results from wanting to help, but not always being able to due to things like professional boundaries, workload capacity, and just not necessarily having the resources or skills necessary to address a problem. And the following demonstrates examples of compassion fatigue in policing. One investigator shared that the hardest part about doing this work was, quote, not being able to fix things for my clients, realizing that some children are born into horrible circumstances and that their chances of completely escaping the poverty, violence, and misery surrounding them are small. Another said, quote, it never ends. No matter how many cases we, quote, solve, it doesn't seem to make a dent in the overall picture. And finally, an internet crimes against children task force member shared, quote, I often feel helpless because I have to watch movie files of some scumbag sexually assaulting a child and I can't do anything to stop it. I can only put this guy in prison who possesses or distributes the material, and that's if the district attorney files charges. That's my biggest frustration with this line of work. Similar to compassion fatigue is what we call secondary traumatic stress, which is now actually considered a form of post-traumatic stress disorder that manifests through indirect exposures to traumatized populations as a result of their everyday work experiences. And what's unique about secondary traumatic stress is that it stems from ongoing indirect exposures to work versus having personal related traumas or experiencing trauma firsthand. So, for example, you can't get secondary traumatic stress from watching horrific things on the news, but you can get it from regularly watching child pornography or, crafting an arrest warrant in the capacity of your officer and having to view, images or videos or audio of horrific encounters as part of your everyday work life. So in terms of symptoms, secondary traumatic stress is actually the same as post-traumatic stress, but only varies according to the source of the stress and trauma. So quintessential example of post-traumatic stress and secondary traumatic stress is intrusive thoughts. These are the flashbulb memories that occur in our heads that we can't always control and don't always know when or how they're triggered. And officers, for example, officers who investigate murders may work particularly heinous cases and have flashbacks to crime scene photos from 20 years ago. Secondary traumatic stress is also characterized by avoidance behaviors, such as avoiding people, places, or things that remind you of an event. This is where officers become physically distant and withdrawn because they are avoiding situations and things that remind them of the event. So, for example, we had an officer tell us that he doesn't particularly like going to the mall, which I get that. But mostly because, not necessarily the mall, but places where children are having fun, because the sound of children screaming reminds him of work. And while most people would, enjoy seeing children thrive and having a good time, when you are constantly exposed to horrific crimes against children, hearing laughter, the screams of children takes on a much different process in which we process that information. Other examples occur when officers try to keep busy to avoid seeking help or even going home. So they'll take on second jobs, do additional detail work, all of which to keep their mind occupied. And the final symptom is hypervigilance. And this is a sense of regularly feeling on edge, having a very hard time sleeping, concentrating, and becoming very quick to anger or just being very irritable all the time. So to explain the differences between post-traumatic stress and secondary traumatic stress, primary trauma, or the traumatic stressor that triggers post-traumatic stress, this type of primary exposure occurs in the line of duty, such as a first responder. There is a direct exposure to a trauma where the trauma is happening to the person directly. The situation is terrifying, and during the traumatic situation, the person is potentially in harm's way, or they are overwhelmed by the horror and terror of the situation. So post-traumatic stress is a personal experience where the person either witnesses or a traumatic event, or the traumatic event is happening to them. And so really what taps into this is this idea that post-traumatic stress comes from a situation where the person is in actual danger and the harm is either happening to them or could have happened to them. Whereas secondary comes from indirect exposure. So when we are hearing, listening, viewing, or reading about particularly traumatic incidences as a part of our job. So indirect exposure to trauma, witnessing or hearing graphic testimony, watching videos or audio recordings, listening to clients describe their trauma. And so again, what separates secondary from primary trauma is that in secondary traumatic incidences, you are not in actual danger. You are not at the scene of the traumatic event, seeing firsthand results of, like a shooting or just mass chaos. And so both secondary traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress have the same symptoms and are under the same diagnoses, yet they just differ in terms on direct versus indirect exposure, and secondary traumatic stress has to be related to traumatic exposures as part of one's professional or work-related responsibilities. And so secondary traumatic stress can sound a lot like what one sex crime investigator had to say is, the hardest part about doing this work is what I hear and what I see. It wears me out. Other examples of secondary traumatic stress came from a forensic interviewer who said, quote, sitting in the presence of and being very present for the trauma of others. Constant reminders of the very terrible things people do to children, and really knowing that there are scared children being hurt in the world right now. Others said, quote, having intrusive thoughts about the disclosures we hear from children and letting that affect my personal sex life. And finally, an Internet Crimes Against Children task force member stated, quote, listening to people outside my work complain about their problems when I've seen real problems in horrible situations. Sometimes I just want to grab someone complaining about something and scream at them, were you raped by your stepdad today? Then shut up. All of these concepts are important because vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, and compassion fatigue all increase officers' susceptibility to becoming emotionally exhausted and disengaged, and eventually leaving their agency or the profession entirely. Without adequate stress management strategies and support from agencies, officers are going to continue to struggle until mental health becomes a priority within agencies.